the Corcyrian spoke first. They offered something remarkable. One of the largest navies in Greece, a strategic position in the Western Sea, and a ready-made alliance. All they need in return is protection from Corinth. But now it was time for the Corinthians to rise and tell Athens to refuse. Last time, we entered a world on the edge of war, a fragile peace, and an island power called Corcyra that had just done something extraordinarily bold. They had walked into Athens and asked the most powerful maritime force in Greece to take its side. The Corcyrians had made their case, and it was a good one. They had offered Athens their fleet, one of the largest in the Greek world. They had argued that war was coming regardless, and that Athens would be better off facing it with Corcyra than without them. It was a dangerous proposition. But was it dangerous enough to ignite the entire Greek world into war? That depended on what happened next. Because now it was Corinth's turn. Corinth, remember, was one of the great city-states of the Greek world, and one of Sparta's most important allies. And it was the city that, if Athens sided with Corcyra, would become Athens' most dangerous enemy on the sea. Now the assembly was silent, and a Corinthian ambassador rose up to speak. These Corcyrians, in the speech we have just heard, do not confine themselves to the question of their reception into your alliance. They also talk of us Corinthians being guilty of injustice, and themselves being the victims of an unjustifiable war. It becomes necessary for us to touch upon both these points before we proceed to the rest of what we have to say, so you may have a more correct idea of the grounds of our claim, and have good cause to reject Corcyra's petition. According to Corcyra, their old policy of refusing all offers of alliance was a policy of moderation. But it was in fact adopted for bad ends, not for good. Indeed, their conduct is such as to make them by no means wishful of having allies present to witness it, or of having the shame of asking for their approval. Corcyra's geographical situation makes them independent of others, and consequently, the decision in cases when they cause harm to others lies not with judges appointed by mutual agreement, but with Corcyra itself. Because while Corcyra seldom makes voyages to their neighbors, it is constantly being visited by foreign vessels which are compelled to put in at its ports. In short, the goal Corcyra set for itself in this deceptive policy of having no allies is not to avoid participating in the crimes of others, but to secure a monopoly of the crimes itself, the license to commit outrage wherever they can compel, to practice fraud wherever they can elude, and to enjoy the gains without shame. And yet if Corcyra were the honest state they pretend to be, the less power that other had over her, the more strongly she could have shown her honesty by giving and taking what was fair. But such has not been Corcyra's conduct, either towards others or towards us. The attitude of this colony towards us, her parent state, has always been one of estrangement, and is now one of hostility. For Corcyra say, we were not sent out to be ill-treated. To that we reply, we did not found the colony to be insulted by it, but to be their head, and to be regarded with a proper respect. At any rate, our other colonies honor us, and we are much beloved by our colonists. And clearly, if the majority are satisfied with us, Corcyra can have no good reason for a dissatisfaction in which it stands alone. We are therefore not acting improperly in making war against them, nor are we making war without provocation. Besides, if we were in the wrong, it would be honorable by Corcyra to give way to our wishes, and therefore make it disgraceful for us to take advantage of their moderation. But in the pride and license of wealth, Corcyra have sinned again and again against us, and never more deeply than when Epidamnus, our dependency, which Corcyra took no steps to claim in its distress and civil war, but when we were on our way to relieve it, Corcyra seized it, and Epidamnus is still held by force of arms. As to the claim that Corcyra wished the question to be first submitted to arbitration, it is obvious that the challenge from the party who is safe in a commanding position cannot receive the same credit only due to the one who, before appealing to arms, shows honorable intentions in deeds as well as words. In Corcyra's case, it was not before they lay siege to Epidamnus, but only after they understood that we would not passively suffer such treatment that they thought of arbitration. And not satisfied with their own misconduct there, they appear here now, requiring you Athenians to join with them, not in alliance, but in crime, and to receive them despite the fact that they are at open enmity with us. It is when Corcyra stood firmest that it should have made proposals to you, not at a time when we have been wronged and Corcyra is in peril, not at a time when you would be admitting into your protection those who have never admitted you to share in their power, and would be incurring from us an equal amount of blame for the offences in which you had no hand. No, Corcyra should have shared its power with you before asking you to share your fortunes with them. So then, the reality of the grievances we come to complain of, and the violence and greed of our opponents, have both been demonstrated. But that you cannot rightfully receive Corcyra, this you have still to learn. It may be true that one of the provisions of the treaty is that it shall be free for any city, whose name was not down on the list, to join whichever side it pleases. But this agreement is not meant for those whose purpose in joining is the injury of the other powers, but for those whose need of support does not arise from the fact of defection, and whose adhesion will not bring to the power that is mad enough to receive them war instead of peace, which will be the case with you if you refuse to listen to us, since you cannot become their ally and remain our friend. If you join Corcyra in its attack on us, you must share in the punishment which we, the defenders, inflict on them. And yet you have the best possible right to remain neutral, or failing that, you should instead join us against Corcyra. Corinth is at least in treaty with you. With Corcyra, you were never even in truce. But do not establish the precedent that defection can be supported by outsiders. Did we, when Samos defected, vote against you when the rest of the Peloponnesian powers were equally divided on the question whether they should assist Samos against you or not? No, we told them to their faces that every power has a right to discipline deserters. If you make it your policy to receive and assist all offenders, you will find that just as many of your own allies will come over to us, and the principle that you establish will press more heavily on you than on us. This then is what Greek law entitles us to demand as a right. We have also advice to offer, and claims on your gratitude, which, since there is no danger of us injuring you, as we are not enemies, but since our friendship does not amount to very frequent interaction, we say, let this matter be settled at the present juncture. When you were in need of ships of war for the war against Aegina before the Persian invasion, Corinth supplied you with 20 vessels. That good turn, and the line we took on the question of Samos, when we were the cause of the Peloponnesians refusing to assist them, enabled you to conquer Aegina and to punish Samos. And we acted so in times of crises, when, if ever, men tend in their efforts against their enemies to forget everything for the sake of victory. In times like these, the one who then assists is regarded a friend, even if he thus far has been considered a foe, and the one who opposes is then viewed as a foe, even if he thus far has been considered a friend. Indeed, men allow their real interests to suffer from their absorbing preoccupation with the struggle. Weigh these past favors that we have given you well, and let your young learn of them from their elders, and let both determine to do unto us as we have done to you. And let them not acknowledge the justice of what we say, only to dispute its wisdom in the event of war. Not only is the straightest path, generally speaking, the wisest, but the coming of the war, which the Corcyrians have used to scare you and to persuade you to act wrongly, is still uncertain. It is not worth to be carried away by it and gaining the instant and declared enmity of Corinth. It would rather be wise to try to counteract the unfavorable impression which your conduct towards Megara has already created. For kindness opportunely shown has a greater power of removing old grievances than the bare facts of the case might suggest. And do not be seduced by the prospect of a great naval alliance. Abstinence from all injustice to other equal powers is a greater tower of strength than anything that can be gained by the sacrifice of permanent tranquility for an apparent temporary advantage. Now it is our turn to benefit from the precedents that we lay down at Sparta, that every power has a right to discipline its own allies, including our colony of Corcyra. We now claim the same from you, and protest against your way of repaying us for benefiting you by our vote, by injuring us by yours. On the contrary, return the favor, like for like, remembering that this is the very crisis in which the one who lends aid is most a friend, and he who opposes is most a foe. And for these Corcyrians, neither receive them into your alliance despite our objections, nor be their partners in crime. Do this, and you will act as we have a right to expect of you, and at the same time best consult your own interests. Upon hearing this, the Athenians hesitated. The first assembly ended without a vote. They could not make up their minds. Both arguments had landed. Both carried weight, and the Athenians knew what it meant to choose. They would sleep on it, and in the morning they would decide. Thucydides tells us that on the second day of deliberation, Athens voted. The decision, however, was not clear-cut. Looking at the arguments, both sides had made serious points. This was not the case of one party being obviously right and the other obviously wrong. It was two legally defensible positions, pulling in the opposite directions. The Corcyrians, for their part, had made both strategic and legal arguments. The strategic argument was blunt and effective. Corcyra's fleet, more than 100 warships, was not a talking point. It was a real fleet, with real rowers and real bronze rams. In a war that both sides already suspected was coming, that fleet sitting in Corinthian hands was a threat Athens could not afford to ignore. The Western Sea route, through Corcyra, up the Adriatic to the grain-producing regions of Italy and Sicily, was a lifeline that Athens genuinely needed to protect. The legal argument was solid too. The 30 Years' Peace explicitly permitted unaligned cities to join whichever league they chose. Corcyra had never been a member of either, and by the letter of the treaty, Athens was entirely within its right to admit them into the Delian League. The Corcyrians also made a subtler argument, playing on the fears of Athens, that war between Athens and Sparta was only a matter of time, and that Athens should position itself accordingly. Better to act now, from a position of strength, than to wait and find the Western Sea already lost. It was a compelling case. The Corinthian response operated on both legal and moral grounds. On the legal question, Corinth made a point that opposed the Corcyrian position. Yes, the peace permitted unaligned cities to seek new alliances, but Corcyra had not come to Athens as a neutral party seeking protection. It had come as a city already at war with Corinth, and seeking Athens' help only as a weapon. Admitting Corcyra under those circumstances, Corinth argued, was not a neutral act. It would be considered intervention. Now this was a sound argument, especially in combination with the fact that Corinth argued that Corcyra was effectively already Corinthian domain by virtue of its colonial relationship with Corinth, and therefore making the right to discipline one's ally without the intervention of the other league applicable. If Athens were to admit Corcyra, Corinth argued, would interfere with the right to discipline one's ally and thus lead to a breach of the treaty. Corinth also challenged the Corcyrian claim that arbitration had been refused, arguing that the offer to resolve the dispute was made in bad faith from the start. In fact, Corcyra had proposed arbitration only after it became clear that Corinth was genuinely coming to the relief of Epidamnus. The offer, therefore, was intended either to delay Corinthian action or to provoke a rejection that would allow Corcyra to portray Corinth as the aggressor. In this view, the proposal was not a sincere attempt at resolution, but a cunning legal maneuver. On the moral level, Corinth argued that a debt of gratitude should be repaid. On previous occasions, they argued, Corinth had shown restraint towards Athens, even when alternative courses of action were available, particularly by allowing Athens to discipline its own allies in the form of Samos that had rebelled before. Now, they claimed that restraint should be repaid. In the end, Athens chose the more pragmatic approach. The Corcyrian fleet was too valuable for Athens and too dangerous to fall into the hands of the Corinthians. But Athens still chose very carefully. Aware of the signal a full alliance would send, they chose the middle path, the defensive alliance only. They voted that they would send 10 ships to the support of Corcyra, the minimum necessary to signal commitment without constituting aggression. It was to a degree legally defensible, but strategically it was arguably the best choice. And yet, Thucydides himself, in his analysis of the war's true causes, he sets aside the legal question entirely. He writes that the most genuine reason was the growth of Athenian power and the fear that growth inspired in her adversaries. Not a treaty violation, not a diplomatic incident. Simply fear. The 30 Years' Peace was not just a legal document. It was a set of shared understandings, a tacit agreement not to push. Athens, by accepting Corcyra, had pushed. It had extended its reach westward, into the waters Corinth considered its own sphere, and demonstrated once again that Athenian power recognized no natural boundary. Corinth would spend the coming years lobbying Sparta relentlessly. They would bring this decision, and others like it, before the Spartan assembly. They would argue that Athens had already broken the spirit of the peace, that restraint was weakness, that war was inevitable, and therefore better fought now than later. The question that now faced them was not if war was coming, but if anyone could or even wanted to stop it. Athens had chosen, and the consequences were already on their way.